Now part of the Darkcast network. Welcome to Indie Podcasts with a dark side.
On the morning of Thursday, July 12th, 1906, Robert Morrison realized that a young couple who had rented one of his rowboats on Big Moose Lake the previous afternoon had never brought it back. Robert rented boats to visitors, and at first, the missing boat hadn't seemed especially alarming. He thought the couple may have decided to stay somewhere else across the lake. But when Thursday morning came, and there was still no sign of them, Robert gathered a search party and headed out onto the water in a steamboat. Near Camp Craig, they spotted the missing rowboat floating upside down. Then, a young boy working as the steamboat's purser noticed something pale beneath the surface of the lake. The searchers lowered a long spiked pole into the water to find out what it was. When they caught hold of the object and pulled it towards the surface, a woman's head and chest came out of the water first. It was the body of a young woman, and there were deep cuts, abrasions, and other injuries around her forehead, temple, and mouth. Dr. Coffin, the coroner who was called to the scene, immediately suspected there could be more to the woman's death than just a simple drowning. But before investigators could figure out what had happened to her, they first had to figure out who she was. Their first clue came from the registration book at the nearby Glenmore Hotel. The day before, a couple had checked in under the names of Carl Graham, but the Graham was spelled Graham. Carl Graham of Albany and Grace May Brown of South Otselic. The woman had used her real name. That quickly led authorities to 20-year-old Grace May Brown, an employee at the Gillette skirt factory in Cortland, New York. On July 13, Grace's father, Frank Brown, arrived and formally identified his daughter. Once investigators knew who Grace was, they started hearing another name. People who knew her said she had been keeping company with a young man named Chester Ellsworth Gillette. No one seemed to know anyone named Carl Graham, but they sure did know Chester. Before investigators could understand how Grace ended up at the bottom of Big Moose Lake, they needed to understand who she was and how Chester fit into her life. And before I go into that, let me tell you who I am and how I fit into this case. My name is Kai, and this is Love and Murder, Heartbreak to Homicide, and I bring you true crime cases every week, telling you stories of relationships that went from love to heartbreak to murder. Real quick before we continue, if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and subscribe on whatever platform you're currently listening on. But the best way to subscribe to Love and Murder so that you don't miss an episode is by subscribing to the Patreon for free. Patreon.com/Love and Murder. I'll talk more about that at the end of this show. But for now, let's get back into how Grace ended up at the bottom of the lake. Grace had been born on March 20th, 1886, and grew up in South Otselic, a small community in Chenango County, New York. Her family owned a successful dairy farm, and Grace was a middle child. Friends often called her Billy, or Billie, so they have just two spellings in my notes, Billy, Billy, or Billie. So they called her Billy, which was a nickname connected to the popular song, You Won't Come Home, Bill Bailey. She was also close to one of her teachers, Maud Kenyon Crum, and Maud's husband, and sometimes signed her letters with The Kid after Billy the Kid. By the time Grace was 18, she wanted something different from life on her family's farm. In 1904, she moved to Cortland to live with her older sister, Ada, who had recently had a baby. Grace helped her sister and eventually began working at the Gillette skirt factory. Now, Chester had grown up very differently. He was born in Montana in 1883 to parents who were devoted members of the Salvation Army. They had given up many of their possessions to dedicate themselves to missionary work, so Chester spent most of his childhood moving from place to place. The family lived in several states, including Washington, Oregon, Wyoming, California, and even Hawaii. There wasn't much financial stability, but Chester had a wealthy uncle, Noah Horace Gillette, who stepped in to help him. Noah paid for Chester to attend the preparatory academy at Oberlin College in Ohio, where he stayed for about 2 years before leaving in 1903. Chester apparently wasn't especially interested in his studies, and afterwards he worked a series of jobs, including as a railroad brakeman in Chicago. Then, in the spring of 1905, Chester offered his nephew another opportunity. He owned the successful Gillette skirt factory in Cortland and offered Chester a job there. Chester moved to New York and quickly became comfortable in Cortland's wealthier social circles. He was handsome and charming, attended parties, socialized with women from prominent families, and seemed interested in moving up socially. Meanwhile, Grace was working at the same factory. The two worked in different departments, so they didn't necessarily meet as soon as Chester arrived. Now, there was a popular story that Grace once dropped a ring at work and it rolled across the floor until Chester stopped it with his shoe. But nobody knows if that's really true. It's just been something that's been told over and over as more of a romanticized version of their meeting. So we don't actually know how they met. However, when they actually met by the summer of 1905, Grace and Chester were seeing each other. The relationship became serious, well, at least for Grace. She saw Chester exclusively and fell deeply in love with him. And at first, Chester seemed just as interested. During the summer of 1905, while Grace was away visiting her family, Chester wrote to tell her how much he missed her. Quote, "You don't seem to know how lonesome it is now, with nothing to do evenings. Sunday was the dullest day I have known in a long time. That night, I went to bed about 9, but I laid awake for nearly 2 hours thinking of everything, principally you. Hurry back, as you don't know how lonesome it is here." You know how people like to say, back in the day, we never had... This sounds like love bombing just in 1900s talk, 1905 talk, you know what I'm saying? This is straight up love bombing. They didn't do things exactly as they did now, but they still did them. Like people say, there wasn't autism back then. There was totally autism. People just put you in an insane asylum and didn't want to, think about it. Just like if you, had a period and it was really bad, then a woman was insane. They put you in an insane asylum. They had the same things then that they have now. They just dealt with them differently. Anyway, while Grace was treating their relationship as something exclusive, Chester continued socializing with other women. He also kept his relationship with Grace mostly hidden. Grace was a factory worker, while Chester was the nephew of the factory owner and had access to social circles that she didn't. So he couldn't taint his name, then move on. Go talk to one of those women in the social circles. What are you doing talking to her and wasting her time? But then, in the spring of 1906, Grace found out she was pregnant. So that's what he was doing with her. He didn't think she was good enough to marry, but he thought she was good enough for a romp in the hay. But he couldn't tell people about her because he still had to save face so that he could go on and marry somebody who was in his own social circle. What a jerk. Now, I know nowadays, if somebody is unmarried with pregnancy, it's not a scandal like in the ton. But back then, an unmarried pregnancy could destroy a young woman's reputation. And Grace was terrified about what would happen if her family and the people around her found out. She wanted Chester to make a decision about their future, make an honest woman of her. But instead, he encouraged her to go back to her parents' house in South Ostelic for a while. Now, I may be saying the name of that town wrong, so I apologize. It's Otselic. Otselic. So he told her that. He's like, just go home to your parents. I'll be here. I'll be along in a while. And Grace was like, I ain't stupid. Quote, You have succeeded in making me leave Cortland for a time. It makes me feel badly to think you think I don't know why you wanted me to come home. I ain't no fool. Please write me and tell me all about how you have not thought about me once or missed me at all, and how you don't want me to come back. So while Grace was home trying to hide her pregnancy from her parents and everybody around her, she also started hearing that Chester was spending time with other women in Cortland. And his response didn't exactly reassure her. Quote, "As to the numerous accusations you make, they are all true. So perhaps I had better not come at all. In fact, I think that would be better for both. I hope you will feel better when you come back, but do not rush your work too hard because of it, hoping you will understand my reasons for writing as I do." What a butthole. What a ginormous gaping butthole. So he was literally just going to abandon her and his child. So when Grace got this letter, she was just like, what happened to this guy? He used to write her such warm, kind, loving letters before, and now this is what she got. And in turn, her letters became more desperate as the weeks passed. She briefly returned to Cortland, where people at the factory noticed her crying and saw her having tense conversations with Chester, but she eventually went back home to her parents. By June 1906, Grace was still pushing Chester to tell her what they were going to do, while Chester continued delaying. "Grace, mamas, I'm going to hold your hand while I tell you this. He don't want you. You're going to have to figure out what you're going to do with yourself and your baby. And you might as well tell your family. I mean, they may send you away, let you have the baby, make you give it up so you don't put like a dark cloud over the family's head. But you're going to have to figure out what you're going to do by yourself, because this man don't want you." And I said that about giving the child up for adoption because sometimes, a lot of times, that's what they did back in the day. They sent the woman away to a whole other town way far, far away, like a distant aunt, let her have the baby over there, put the baby up for adoption, then brought the child back, brought the woman back and said, oh yeah, she was out resting. She was suffering from hysteria and pox and I don't know, whatever other stuff they say back then. And, she just needed a snort. You know what I'm saying? Back when they thought that was medicine. She just needed a snort and, to rest her head from the heat of New York, or I guess the cold of New York. So now she's back, and I want to present my daughter Grace at the next cotillion. I might be using all of these terminologies incorrectly because, look, I wasn't born back then. So, and it's not something that I like going back and, oh, that was a nice age. No, that's not me. So I don't know the terminologies they used. But anyways, Grace, that's probably what you should have done instead of constantly going to Chester, who's trying to avoid you. He's trying beyond belief to avoid you. And instead of running after a dude, you should have just figured to take care of it by yourself. But she was young. She was only in her early 20s, and she was back then. So while she's trying to convince him, her letters started getting more and more dark. For instance, quote, "If I could only die. If I die, I hope then you can be happy. I hope I can die. Oh, please come and take me away. Please write and tell me you would come for me before Saturday." But Grace wasn't only writing about wanting to die. She also was trying to get Chester to take responsibility for the situation they were in. Quote, "My life is ruined and, in a measure, yours too." He's a guy back then, and sometimes today, he can and would walk away. So you're the one who has to carry the baby. You're the one who's seen with the belly. You're the one who scandal. So not really his, unless you kind of go have the baby and go to, I guess, the rich neighborhoods and tell them that it's his baby. And then hopefully the baby looks like him, because more than likely they're going to believe him over you. So, it was tough back then. But But anyway, so she said, my life is ruined and yours is too. And she continued saying, quote, the world and you too may think that I am the one to blame, but somehow I can't. Just simply can't think that I am. I said no so many times. Wow. In another letter, she described how trapped she felt and how many times she had tried to resist what Chester wanted. Quote, I know that you don't care for me anymore like you did, and that you were wishing things could be different. And yet, what am I to do? I know you'll say that it has all been as much my fault as yours, and the world, if it knew, might think so too. But how often did I beg you not to make me do what I did not want to do, and wish I was afraid even then I would regret, although I loved you too much to let you go, if you still insisted on having your way. So this is sounding like something else. Like she didn't want to do it, and he kept insisting that they did it, and she literally kept saying no and begging him no, and then he did it anyway. Interesting. Sounding like something entirely different now. Then he got her pregnant. That's what I was saying in the beginning. He's only with her because he thought of her as a lowly worker. He took advantage of her, sexually assaulted her, that's what it sounded like, and then left her pregnant and basically told her, go home to your parents so they don't see that she's pregnant and his name isn't tarnished. So yeah, he's a bigger douchebag than I originally thought. So anyway, she wrote that to him. Then she begged him again, saying, quote, oh, please, please, I beg of you not to torture me with any more delays now. Grace believed Chester was eventually going to take her away. Exactly what she thought would happen during that trip wasn't completely clear, but she appeared to expect that they would either marry or that he would take her somewhere where she could have the baby away from everyone who knew her. Either way, Chester invited her on a trip. She got excited. She packed as if she wasn't coming home again. So she didn't pack for like, oh, I'm just going away from the weekend. She packed all her stuff. And then she was like, okay, when are we going? And he kept changing the timing of the trip, and Grace eventually became tired of waiting. She threatened to return to Cortland if he didn't come for her, which would have made hiding the pregnancy even more difficult. Then on July 5th, Grace wrote what would become her final letter to Chester. She talked about leaving her family and the home she had grown up. Quote, I know I shall never again see any of them. And Mama, how I do love Mama. I don't know what I shall do without her. Sometimes I think if I could tell Mama, but I can't. She has trouble enough as it is, and I couldn't break her heart like that. If I come back dead, perhaps she does not know. She won't be angry with me. 3 days after that, Chester began the trip. On July 8th, 1906, he arrived in DeRuyter, New York, and checked into a hotel under the name of Charles George. The following day, July 9th, Grace met him there. From DeRuyter, the two took a train to Utica and checked into another hotel where Chester registered them as Charles Gordon and wife. On July 10th, Chester had some of his clothes taken to a laundry under his real name and instructed them to be sent to Old Forge. Then he and Grace left their Utica hotel without paying the bill. They continued north to Tupper Lake, where Chester again used the name Charles George and registered them as husband and wife. While they were traveling, Grace tried to keep her family from worrying and sent her mother a postcard. Quote, Dear Mother, I'm having a lovely time. Don't worry, we'll write you more tonight about the trip. It was rather unexpected, but I'm glad we are here. Chester was also sending mail. He sent a postcard back to the Gillette skirt factory asking for $5 out of his pay to be sent to Eagle Bay, New York. She's sending her mom loving letters and he's asking for money. By the morning of Wednesday, July 11th, Grace's emotional state appeared to be getting worse. At Tupper Lake, she became so upset during breakfast that she had a severe crying spell and a waitress had to help her. I kind of have a feeling that he told her that they weren't going to get married and he didn't want to be with her, and so she was just like, well, my life is over. Afterwards, Grace and Chester boarded another train and began heading south. Grace had her large trunk sent ahead to Old Forge, but instead of continuing directly there, Chester suggested that they stopped at Big Moose Lake. When they arrived at the Glenmore Hotel, Chester used another false name. This time, he registered himself as Carl Graham of Albany, while Grace registered under her real name and hometown. Chester's suitcase had his initials CEG on it, and the name Carl Graham was later viewed as an attempt to use an alias that wouldn't immediately conflict with the monogram luggage that he was carrying. After checking in, Chester and Grace went down towards the boathouse, where they met Robert Morrison. Chester rented a light rowboat for the afternoon, and Robert noticed that he wanted to take a suitcase and tennis racket with him. Grace and Chester went out onto the Big Moose Lake, where vacationers saw them rowing and picnicking during the afternoon. Then, sometime around 6 p.m., something happened. Nearby vacationers later reporting hearing a woman scream, and after that, Grace was never seen alive again. But Chester was. That night, he came out of the lake wet, made his way through the woods, and walked towards the town of Inlet. The tennis racket he had taken onto the boat with him was no longer with him. When he reached the Arrowhead Hotel, Chester checked in under his real name and spent the next couple of days socializing, playing games, and behaving like another tourist on vacation. At one point, he even asked whether anyone had heard about a drowning at Big Moose Lake. Now, I think he did all that, like, he checked in under aliases because he figured, who would know. Then he checked in under himself to say, oh, yeah, I came here and I was, just here on vacation or whatever. Did I know her? No, I don't know what you're talking about. I have a feeling this was all part of the plan. Meanwhile, Robert had found the overturned boat and Grace's body beneath the water. Once investigators identified Grace and started asking questions about Carl Graham, people who knew her began connecting the mysterious man to Chester. And by Saturday, July 14, those suspicions were getting even stronger. That morning, 5 doctors performed an autopsy and found several serious injuries to Grace's head and face. One injury near her left eye was believed to have been severe enough to cause blindness, while another blow several inches above her ear could have rendered her unconscious. The injuries made investigators question whether Grace had simply fallen into the lake and drowned, or something else had happened. On that same day, Herkimer County District Attorney George W. Ward was preparing to travel to the area to investigate her death when he was approached at the Utica train station by Bert Gross, another employee at the Gillette skirt factory. Bert had been following the reports about Grace and was worried Chester might be involved. He gave District Attorney Ward a description of Chester, and it matched the descriptions investigators had received of Carl Graham. Bert also knew about the postcard Chester had sent to the factory, asking for $5 of his wages to be mailed to Eagle Bay. That gave investigators somewhere to look. District Attorney Ward, Bert, and the other investigators went to Eagle Bay and checked the hotel registers, but they couldn't find Chester or Carl Graham. So District Attorney Ward tried the local post office. The postmaster said no mail had arrived for Chester yet, but Chester had already left instructions saying that anything addressed to him should be forwarded to the Arrowhead Hotel in Inlet. So, investigators were looking for him, and they went straight there. As District Attorney Ward and the others were making inquiries at the front desk, Chester walked out of the dining room after finishing breakfast. He immediately recognized Bert and seemed surprised to see one of his coworkers standing there. Bert asked if he had heard that Grace was dead, and Chester acted his ass off. Oh my God, Grace is dead? Are you serious? Of course, he didn't say that, but he acted shocked. District Attorney Ward then began questioning him about where he had been over the previous several days, but Chester's answers were evasive and didn't match what investigators were already learning. He didn't know that they knew that he knew that they knew. So he was lying his butt off, not knowing that they knew the truth. and he was arrested. At first, Chester denied that he had even been on Big Moose Lake with Grace, but witnesses had seen them together. The Glenmore Hotel register connected Grace to Carl Graham, and the description of Carl matched Chester. Eventually, Chester changed his story. He admitted that he had been with Grace, but he denied killing her, claiming that her death had either been a terrible accident or that Grace had taken her own life. Now, I have a couple of questions for him. First of all, why were you lying? That's just number one. And, you're lying and now we're supposed to believe your story. But then you're like, it was either an accident or she committed suicide. But which one? You were there. So which one? Investigators also started collecting the paper trail the couple had left behind. Grace's trunk, which had been sent ahead to Old Forge, contained letters Chester had written to her. When confronted with them, Chester admitted that they were his and then told District Attorney Ward that Grace's letters to him were still in his rented room in Cortland. Deputies went and got him, and they gave investigators a much clearer picture of Grace's pregnancy, her desperation, Chester's delays, and the pressure she had been putting on him to make a decision. Then there was the missing tennis racket. Multiple witnesses had seen it strapped to Chester's suitcase before he and Grace went out onto Big Moose Lake. But it was gone when Chester arrived at Inlet. Chester eventually admitted that he had buried it in the woods during his walk from the lake. He claimed that he had panicked and feared the racket would somehow be connected to Grace's death. Probably because it was. Investigators later recovered it, and the racket was described as broken in a way that appeared consistent with it having struck something hard. By August 1906, Chester had been formally indicted for the first-degree premeditated murder of Grace Brown. His trial started on November 12, 1906, and in Herkimer County Courthouse before Judge Irvin R. Devendorf. By then, Grace's death had become a national story. More than 1,000 people crowded around the courthouse. Newspapers followed nearly every development, and there was intense speculation over whether another woman had played some role in Chester wanting Grace out of his life. One of the names appearing in the newspapers was Harriet Benedict, a wealthy young woman from Cortland who was rumored to be someone Chester had hoped to marry. Harriet eventually released a statement denying that Hay had ever been engaged. Quote, "I have never been engaged to Chester E. Gillette. Our acquaintance was of a limited duration, and that not a word or suggestion was ever made between us about an engagement." She basically said, I don't know that dude, and don't ever say that we were engaged. I kind of, was an acquaintance of him. So it was like, hi, bye, what's up? Bye, what's the weather like? It's raining tomorrow. That's all we talked about. And that's all we ever were going to talk about. It's basically what she said. Chester's uncle Noah refused to pay for his defense. So he was represented by court-appointed attorneys Albert M. Mills and Charles D. Thomas. District Attorney Ward led the prosecution. There had been no eyewitnesses in the rowboat when Grace died, so the prosecution had to build its case through circumstantial evidence. District Attorney Ward called 83 witnesses and argued that when the entire timeline was considered together, Chester had a clear motive, an opportunity to kill Grace, and had taken steps before and after her death that showed planning rather than panic. The prosecution argued that Grace's pregnancy threatened the life that Chester wanted in Cortland. He had been moving through wealthier social circles, had kept Grace hidden from much of that world, and now she was demanding that he make a decision while her pregnancy was becoming more difficult to hide. According to District Attorney Ward, the trip wasn't Chester finally agreeing to solve their problem. It was his way of getting Grace somewhere isolated. Rather than retelling every stop of the trip, prosecutors used the aliases, Chester's luggage, the tennis racket, and his behavior after Grace's death to argue that the journey had been planned as a one-way trip for her. The medical evidence became another major part of the case. The 5 doctors who had examined Grace testified about the blunt force injuries found on her head and face, and the prosecution argued that Chester had struck her with a tennis racket before putting her into the water. A witness also testified hearing the high-pitched scream from the lake around the same time that Grace died. Some of District Attorney Ward's tactics, however, went beyond the physical evidence. During his opening statement, he accused Chester of raping Grace, even though there wasn't evidence supporting that allegation. Kind of read her letters. Physical evidence, no. Circumstantial, yes. So, Judge Davendorf later instructed the jury to disregard that allegation that the prosecution had brought forth. The prosecution also attempted to bring Grace's preserved fetus into the courtroom as an exhibit, but Judge Davendorf refused to allow it. Yeah, that's kind of crazy. You're now tugging at heartstrings and using that as, a basis for your case. No. Then came Grace's letters. The jury had already heard about the pregnancy and the problems between Grace and Chester, but the letters allowed them to hear Grace describe those problems in her own words. District Attorney Ward read portions of the correspondence aloud, including the desperate letters Grace had written while waiting for Chester to make a decision, and the July 5th letter where she talked about leaving her mother and worried that she might come back dead. People in the courtroom openly cried while the letters were read, and the public became so interested in them that copies were printed in booklet form and sold outside the courthouse. So are we saying this is the first form of true crime podcast? For the prosecution, those letters weren't just emotional. District Attorney Ward argued that they showed Grace believed the trip was supposed to solve her pregnancy, while Chester knew he had another plan. He also asked the jury to consider what Chester did once Grace was gone. Instead of reporting a drowning or asking anyone for help, he buried the tennis racket, he walked to another town, he checked into a hotel, and he just straight continued his vacation. Then, when investigators found him, he initially denied that he even was with Grace. In his closing argument, District Attorney Ward described Chester as brutal, but also careless. Quote, "He is bloodthirsty and brutal. He is a blunderer. He does not reason on the lines that any one of us do. He reasons on different lines. Everything looks red before him. There's nothing but one object that he is going to grasp, and that is his personal safety." He argued that Chester thought he could leave Grace at the bottom of a lake and go back to the life he wanted in Cortland. He said, quote, "I can do this slyly. I can get the girl to the bottom of the lake. I could do it secretly. I can do it carefully. I stand well in Cortland. I go to church. They think I am a paragon of virtue, a decent man, when in reality I am a ravisher. What I do in secret will be unknown. I can take her out there and leave her body in the lake." Chester's defense didn't try to argue that he had handled Grace's death well. He had lied, hidden the racket, failed to report what happened, and changed his story once investigators confronted him. Instead, Attorney Mills and Thomas argued that those actions made Chester a coward, not necessarily a murderer. Attorney Thomas described him to the jury as just a moral coward. Quote, "Now, gentlemen, there are such things as moral cowards. This boy, in my opinion, in that condition, wandered to the Arrowhead and registered under his own name." According to the defense, Chester knew exactly how bad the situation looked. He had been alone on a secluded lake with a pregnant woman he had been secretly seeing. She was suddenly dead, and he panicked. The attorneys also attacked the medical evidence. Grace's body had been embalmed before the full autopsy, which they argued compromised some of the findings. And under cross-examination, the doctors admitted her body showed signs consistent with drowning. The defense also raised questions about discussions among the doctors before the trial, arguing that they had agreed to downplay the drowning evidence because it could weaken the prosecution's theory that Grace had been beaten unconscious. Wow! No, that's not how this works. That is not how any of this works. You can't just decide. Like, literally, you're making it sound like he's guilty, which means you're the one who decided that, he was guilty. You can't do that. Then Chester took the stand and told the jury what he claimed happened on Big Moose Lake. According to him, he and Grace were talking about the pregnancy when he suggested they should tell her family. Chester said Grace became hysterical because she was terrified of the shame she would face and suddenly said, quote, "Well, I'll end it here." He claims she stood up and threw herself into the lake. Chester said he tried to reach her, but he wasn't fast enough. Quote, "I tried to reach her. I leaned back in the seat in the other end, the bow seat, I guess. I tried to reach her and, well, I was not quick enough." According to Chester, his movement caused the boat to overturn, throwing him into the water as well. "I went into the lake too. The boat tipped over as I started to get up. The boat went right over then. Of course, I went into the lake. Then I came up. I hallowed, grabbed hold of the boat. Then as soon as I could get the water out of my eyes and see, I got hold of the boat or got to the boat." Chester claimed he stayed near the boat for a short time looking for her before finally swimming to shore. He also tried to explain the suitcase and tennis racket. He said that he had only taken the suitcase because it had their picnic lunch and claimed he buried the racket because after Grace drowned, he panicked and became afraid people would wrongly assume that he had used it against her. Well, then I have questions. Why didn't you go for help? You could have anonymously told the police that someone was in a lake. Why did you literally walk around town as if nothing happened? And how did the tennis racket break? You don't want us to think that you used it to hit Grace, but why, when you came into the lake, it was unbroken, looked great as new, but when you come out of the lake and you're burying it, it's broken. A tennis racket doesn't break just because the boat flipped over. The defense also pointed out that there was no evidence Chester and Grace had attempted to obtain an illegal abortion and called witnesses who described Chester as someone who had previously had a good reputation. Still, Chester had another problem that had nothing to do with the physical evidence. Throughout much of the trial, he appeared stone-faced and showed very little emotion. While people in the courtroom cried listening to Grace's letter, Chester sat through the proceedings appearing almost unaffected. I mean, I can't really fault him for that. He could have just been really worried that, if he was innocent, he could have just been really worried that everybody was going to think that he had done this. He had heard the letters before, so, there was nothing for him to cry through the letters. He didn't care about the letters then. He sure ain't gonna care about it now. And for him to start crying now would have actually looked more suspicious. So, on December 4th, 1906, after several weeks of testimony, the case finally went to the jury. The trial record stretched to around 3,000 pages, but the jury reached its decision after about 5 hours of deliberation, although with some of my research, it said, 6. Well, closer to 6. So let's just say between 5 and 6 hours. So Chester was found guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. After the verdict, he sent a short telegram to his family, quote, "I am convicted, will write." Before sentencing, Judge Davendorf gave Chester an opportunity to speak, and he continued to maintain his innocence, saying, quote, "I desire to state that I am innocent of this crime and therefore ought not to be punished. I think that is all." He was sentenced to death by electrocution. Chester's attorneys immediately began the appeals process. One of their main arguments involved Grace's letters. The defense argued that the letters had been so emotional that allowing District Attorney Ward to read them to the jury unfairly prejudiced Chester. The Court of Appeals later described the letters as one of the most difficult legal questions in the case. The judges ultimately decided that portions of them were admissible because they helped establish motive. But they also acknowledged that the prosecution had read sections containing irrelevant personal material that amounted to, quote, girlish gossip. The problem for Chester was that his attorneys hadn't made specific objections to those passages when they were read. So the appellate court decided that the issue wasn't enough to overturn the conviction. The defense also challenged District Attorney Ward's unsupported rape allegation, arguing that accusing Chester of raping Grace in front of the jury had been so inflammatory that Judge Davendorf's instruction to disregard it couldn't undo the damage. Which I agree is true. Just because you said, okay, just strike that from your memory, doesn't mean that's what's going to happen. But the appellate court disagreed. Then the attorneys continued challenging the medical evidence as well, again raising the problems caused by embalming Grace before the autopsy and the doctor's acknowledgments that she had signs of drowning. While those legal arguments worked their way through the courts, Chester's mother, Louise Gillette, began her own campaign to save him. At first, Louise sent Chester a telegram begging him to confess and repent. Chester responded saying, quote, "I am sorry to learn that you believed the newspapers rather than your own son." And after that, Louise became one of his strongest supporters. She raised money for the appeals through paid public lectures and even worked as a traveling correspondent for the Denver Times, writing about her own son's case. She eventually petitioned the government to stop the execution and at one point proposed another explanation for Grace's death, suggesting that Grace may have suffered an epileptic seizure and fallen into the lake. Now you're grasping at straws. Well, the New York Court of Appeals agreed, and on February 18th, 1908, Chester's appeals were rejected, and his conviction and death sentence were affirmed. Associate Justice Frank H. Hiscock wrote, quote, "No controversy throws the shadow of doubt or speculation over the primary fact that about 6 o'clock in the afternoon of July 11th, 1906, while she was with the defendant, Grace Brown met an unnatural death and her body sank to the bottom of Big Moose Lake." Governor Charles Evan Hughes also refused to grant clemency. By then, Chester had been keeping a private diary in prison. He started on September 18th, 1907, and continued writing almost up until his execution. During those final months, he had become deeply religious and spent time speaking with his mother and a minister. There were reports that Chester eventually confessed to killing Grace, but exactly what he meant by the confessions still remains unclear. Some interpretations was that he had finally admitted intentionally killing her, while others questioned whether he was talking about moral guilt instead, accepting responsibility because he had wished she was dead, but then when she fell over, he failed to rescue her or abandoned her after she went into the water. But whatever he meant, it didn't change his sentence, and on the morning of March 30th, 1908, Chester Ellsworth Gillette was executed in the electric chair at Auburn Prison and later buried in an unmarked grave near Auburn, New York. That could have ended the questions surrounding Grace's death, but years later, another issue came up involving the injuries on her face. A man named Roy Higby had been 13 years old in 1906 and had been on the search boat when Grace was found. According to Roy, after something pale was spotted at the bottom of the lake, the boat's engineer used a long spiked pole to repeatedly poke around until they could locate and recover the body. Roy later claimed that some of the cuts and lacerations investigators believe had been caused during an attack may have actually come from that pole striking Grace during the recovery. And Roy had never testified at Chester's trial. According to the account that later emerged, Roy's father eventually told District Attorney Ward what his son had seen, and Attorney Ward reportedly responded with, quote, "If the defense had got this boy on the stand, we would never have convicted Chester Gillette." Wow. Now that doesn't automatically mean Chester was innocent, because the prosecution's case never rested on one piece of evidence alone. But if some of Grace's injuries came from the recovery rather than the attack, then that matters because the physical evidence was the strongest parts of the arguments that Chester had beaten her before she drowned. But beating her and slashing her face are two different things. So I think you would still have to find out about the blunt force trauma, like the one behind her ear, for instance. But I guess when you saw those lacerations to her face, then you would be like, oh, maybe that was a pole. But it still sounds like he beat her to death, buried the broken tennis racket, and then went about his business. So I think even if they knew about that, the prosecution would have still convicted him. I don't agree with them. But to be fair, even after his conviction and execution, there was still room to question whether investigators and the jury had gotten every detail of Grace's death right. And then there was also Chester's prison diary. For nearly 100 years, it was believed to be lost. Then in 2007, Chester's grandniece, Marilyn McWade Murray, found it and donated it to Hamilton College. The 193-page diary covered the period from September 18, 1907, until shortly before Chester's execution. Along with it were several prison letters, including 11 written to a family friend, Bernice Farron, and another to his sister, Hazel Gillette, the night before he died. Those write-ins showed a much more emotional side of Chester than the public had seen at the trial. He wrote that he had actually been struggling with intense emotions in court, but deliberately hid them because he believed controlling himself was the honorable and masculine thing to do. I mean, I hear what you're saying, but your honor went out the window as soon as you forced that girl to have sex with you. So honor kind of went out the window then. And the fact that you were trying to abandon your child, again, a second reason your honor went out the window. Now, him hiding emotion doesn't tell us if he was innocent or guilty, whatever his reasons for hiding his emotions, but it does raise another issue about how the case was viewed at the time. The jury and the public weren't only reacting to the evidence, they were also reacting to a defendant who seemed cold while other people were crying while Grace's letters were being read. But like I said, he had heard the letters before, so there was really no reason for him to cry. I mean, if he was in love with her, I could see him crying from heartbreak, but he was willing to leave her and his kids, so... Grace's death eventually became much larger than the criminal case. In 1925, Theodore Dreiser published An American Tragedy, a novel heavily inspired by Grace and Chester's story. In the novel, he named Chester Clyde Griffiths and Grace Roberta Alden, and then the tennis racket was replaced by a camera. And then in the novel, Clyde goes into the lake thinking about killing Roberta, but then he loses his nerves. And when she moves towards him, he strikes out with the camera. So he hits her with the camera and the boat overturns and she ends up in the water. So that's how it was different from the exact case. And the author also created some prosecutor misconduct. For instance, he had the prosecutor planting the victim's hair on the supposed murder weapon, so planting evidence which didn't happen in the actual case. Then his story was adapted into the 1931 film An American Tragedy, but Theodore hated what Paramount did to his novel, and so he sued them. But Paramount won. And Grace's mother, Minerva Brown, also sued Paramount because she objected to the way the fictional family based on the Browns had been portrayed as dirty, poor, and uneducated. And they settled that lawsuit privately. And then Paramount returned to the story in 1951 with another movie called A Place in the Sun. And this time, the studio changed the character's name even more, and they also changed even more details. And this movie starred Montgomery Clift, Elizabeth Taylor, and Shelley Winters. Grace's story also inspired Jennifer Donnelly's novel, A Northern Light, and the case has continued to be examined in nonfiction books and other works, just like this podcast. But always remember, no matter how many books, movies, and theories came afterwards, the main question never really changed. Grace went on this trip with Chester, believing that, he was finally going to make a decision about their future, whether good or bad, but he was going to make a decision. And I think she had just put in her head that they were about to be together, which is why she packed as if she was never coming back. And then she sent a letter to her mom, a postcard, and then the next day she was dead. The only people who know exactly what happened on that lake, on that rowboat, are Chester and Grace. And Chester never said what happened, and they're both dead now. So what are your thoughts on this case? Do you think after introducing the new evidence that Chester was innocent? And also thinking about it, how much weight should a jury give someone's suspicious behavior, what they consider suspicious behavior, after a death when there's no eyewitnesses to the actual crime? Do you think that if the person's not crying and carrying on that like you think a grieving person should be considered in the case as evidence? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And before you go, don't forget there's even more Love and Murder waiting for you on the Patreon, patreon.com/Love and Murder. You can join for free. Like I told you earlier, you do get some benefits of being a free subscriber. However, one of the main things you get is that you don't ever miss an episode. So whenever an episode comes out, it does come out for the free lambs as well. But if you want more bang for your buck, more of my voice for some reason, to hear more of the cases that we have out, to support the victim story, to support Love and Murder, and just for your own selfish reasons, you just want more case, then join one of our paid tiers starting at $3 a month and above. You do get after shows, you do get bonus episodes. I have been putting out early release of episodes, so you'll get all of that by being part of the Lamb Fam. Patreon.com/Love and Murder. The last bonus episode I had out there, which went out last week, was the case of a man who wanted this woman. He wanted to go out with him, but she said no, and he burned her house down, which left one woman dead and others seriously injured. So that's the last bonus episode I have in there as a Kai Rants. So if you want to hear that case and, more bonus episodes, including the backlog of bonus episodes that I have in there, just join at one of the paid tiers. You can see what each tier offers, starting at $3 a month and above. And don't forget that you become a supporter of the podcast. You help this podcast stay listener funded, and you help me continue to bring the cases to you and be the voice of the victims. Patreon.com/Love and Murder. And also, don't forget to follow me on Facebook, where I'm regularly posting shorter cases, but I haven't been posting in the last 2 weeks, but you still have a backlog of those cases, and more cases are about to start being posted. But you do get shorter cases on the Facebook. You do get updates. You get stories that don't always make it onto the podcast. So don't forget to follow me on Facebook, facebook.com/relationship crime, or the link is in the show notes below. And that is all that I have for you today. As I want to remind you, as we say at the end of each full episode, it is all love and no murder, y'all. Thank you so much for listening. This is the first historical true crime case that I've done. I don't really go back that far, but I decided I wanted to go back and share cases that has happened, I guess, earlier, 1904. Because these people still made mistakes back then that we are making now, and I can still remind people not to make these mistakes. So anyway, thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your time. Thank you for supporting the podcast, and I will see you in the next episode. Unless you're going to go over to the Patreon and patreon.com/Love and Murder, and then I'll see you in a bonus episode. Bye.